She stood up to a prime minister for truth and justice, a decision that cost her her job, a position that the same prime minister previously went out of his way to showcase as a symbol of his inclusivity and faith in the first Indigenous person to hold one of the highest positions in cabinet, a woman he proudly called a star candidate. So who is this woman, and where did she come from? And where did she find the courage to stand up for what she believed was right? Thank you, Jody, for being with us for this conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Oh my gosh, thank you for having me here. It's my
When
pleasure.
you think about your growing up as a kid, how influential was the way you were brought up and where you were brought up to the woman you became?
I think it's pretty much everything. And what I mean by that, I mean, I'm incredibly proud to be Indigenous, to be Kwakwaka'wakw, to come from Cape Mudge, the community where my father's people came from. I credit my parents and my grandparents and my broader family with who I've become and how I've been able to carry myself through the various roles that I've been fortunate enough to play. And for my grandmother in particular, she taught me to always speak the truth, taught me that everybody in a community has a role to play to ultimately contribute to improving quality of life. And in doing so and playing and fulfilling your role or your purpose, which is public service, to always ensure that you strive for equity and equality and inclusion and justice. And that's those values and principles have led me down a path in my life that I had never anticipated, but have provided me with the grounding that I've needed in good times and in not so good times and challenging times.
It's wonderful to grow up not only understanding your cultural heritage, but being proud to be Indigenous. And if you have that in you as a child, that doesn't go away. You mentioned your father, who of course was political in so many ways and a leader and a voice. Did he encourage you to get into leadership positions, or was it just by his modeling?
But yeah, I always felt the support of my father and my mother, who we lived with. My parents separated when we were very young. But he, and this was conscious of on his part, he always made us, and I use the word made us purposefully, follow him to various meetings that he was conducting or speeches that he was given. And both he and my grandmother said, your job is to sit there and to listen to what's happening. Meanwhile, I would hear my friends playing outside the meetings. So in that sense, I think it was always known, and I talk about this a lot in my writing, that I was in some way going to take on a leadership role, and that it was already, predestined to take on various leadership roles, and all of that, going from meeting to meeting and following and watching my dad and my relatives was part of the training.
And so did you feel it was quite natural when you moved into Indigenous politics?
I knew from a very young age that I had to use my skills and abilities, whatever they were and are, to ultimately contribute and to work to improve the quality of life for our people. And for me, life, and certainly my political life, just seems to present itself. And what presented itself to me when I was a prosecutor was the opportunity to go work at the BC Treaty Commission, which I did. And within 9 months, I ended up running to be an elected treaty commissioner But yeah, I've never been one for wanting public attention, wanting positions of perceived power and authority. But what I have always known is that I am at the core of my being a public servant, and had to do what I can, certainly in terms of Indigenous peoples and our place in this country, but more broadly than that, work towards equality and inclusion and justice. And my advocacy over many decades has been paved by those values and principles.
I'm curious what you thought about the Treaty Commission. From the outside, it seems like such complicated, slow process. You saw it from the inside. What did you think of it?
I am not, at this point, certain that achieving or pursuing a comprehensive treaty with the province and the federal government is necessarily across the board the right way to go. At the time, it was one of the so-called only games in town, and a step in terms of settling the land question, certainly, but also creating the space for Indigenous nations to rebuild their governments. In that sense, it's important, and it's important that those communities that have achieved modern treaties through the treaty process, they have done so of their own accord and choice, and are doing tremendous things in their communities. You just look at Tawasin, for example. But times have changed and new opportunities have availed themselves for standalone self-government agreements or reconciliation recognition agreements. So there's more tools in the toolbox that Indigenous peoples have created for themselves to rebuild.
And from that position, you decided to really run for a chief position.
I did, yeah, maybe somewhat reluctantly, but knowing it was what I had to do. I ran for regional chief, and my tagline or motto was building on our success. I can say the 6 years that I was regional chief were probably among the most fulfilling, certainly happiest that I have had in my professional life, because it was on the ground, practical work.
Did your being a woman factor in at all?
I think there was about 6 of us in the race, and on the third ballot, it was myself and another man, and Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, whom you know, stepped down, and he threw his support behind me, and what he said at the time, I'm just paraphrasing, was, we need to have young women involved in politics and in leadership roles. When I did win, and it was by the narrowest of margins back in 2009, I was the only female regional chief. I was the only female around the national executive table. And with that reality came common experiences that women have around tables, that they're the first or the only, having to say things 3 times and without being heard, and then finally heard, or, I remember distinctly, and I talk about this in Indian in the cabinet, one of the regional chiefs, patting my knee and saying, "Don't worry, little lady, I'll protect you," when we were talking about, some contentious political issue.
What was driving you? Did you have an agenda, whether it was about rights or recognition or the mandatory penalties, because you'd been a prosecutor?
What was driving me in my role as regional chief was to create a pathway out of the Indian Act, so Indigenous communities, First Nations, could remove themselves at their own pace and based on their own priorities, so we wouldn't have to negotiate in interminable negotiations or go to court to prove that our rights exist.
Well, the Indian Act, of course, was 1876, and you've called it segregationist, colonial, racist, and you talked about how you get out of it. And yet I don't hear in the broad population any talk about the Indian Act.
I believe fundamentally that the public revelations of the mass graves from residential schools has changed the dialogue and the narrative to a place where Canadians are, one, learning more about the true history of this country and are wanting to understand it better. And what I mean by that is understand that there are different people and different worldviews that exist within our boundaries, and the importance of understanding those different worldviews and how segregating out those views or having one dominant culture dictate to the other simply doesn't work. And one of the primary instruments of that dictation is the Indian Act. So I think people are increasingly becoming more aware of the symptoms of the colonial legacy, whether it be poverty or suicide or having schools that have graveyards. I mean, it's absolutely atrocious. So I think those revelations are prompting people, and this is, for me, the most exciting thing, prompting people to act in ways that challenge governments who have the power and authority to change those laws, to do so, to push them.
So what seduced you into running federally? Or who?
Well, I can make a joke, but I won't. I met a guy named Justin Trudeau, and I'd always had a relationship with former Prime Minister Paul Martin, and he was somewhat of a mentor to me, and I think it was by virtue of that relationship that Trudeau #2 followed me up to Whitehorse and tried to convince me to run to be an MP and run for the Liberal Party.
I'm sure you didn't say yes before you quizzed the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, about his views on the rights agenda, minimum mandatory sentences, that sort of thing. Did you satisfy yourself that he was on the same page as you?
Yeah, we had conversations about our vision for the country. I was very clear about my intentions and what I sought to accomplish and what Indigenous peoples have been asking to be accomplished for decades. And I finally said to him, I'm all in. Like, we, at that time, he had been saying all the right things. In our platform, it talked about the recognition of Indigenous people's rights and how we would seek to accomplish it. By virtue of the fact that I was actually running to be an MP and being able to freely say what our people have been asking for forever, and that forming the basis of our platform. Yeah, I believed it. On criminal justice reform as a prosecutor, knowing what needed to be changed, mandatory minimum penalties for one. These were the things that we had very clearly said we were going to accomplish. And I still to this day, I wonder, should I have seen some sign about what was being said was not necessarily what was going to happen? Was I politically naive, thinking that we were going to do what we said in our platform and accomplish all these things? I'm not naive. I've been around politics for a long time, but I truly believed then, as I know hundreds, millions of people across the country were captivated and wrapped up that change was possible and that we could really do politics differently. I know it's a tagline now that people roll their eyes at, but I truly believe that. I believed it then, and I believe it now, even in spite of what happened in those intervening years.
So you were named to such a significant position right away as Minister of Justice and also Attorney General. Was that a surprise to you?
I immediately was had this tidal wave of emotion, and it was one emotion about the realization of all of the really important issues like medical assistance in dying that I would have to legislate as minister. But it was also emotions more so around what it meant. Accomplishment for me, certainly, but what it meant for the country in that I would be the first Indigenous person to hold this position, and having been or becoming the chief law officer in a country that had for almost 150 years at that time and continued to that day discriminated against my people. But quickly after that initial kind of shock and feeling overwhelmed translated into or turned into the realization that you're only there for a short amount of time. I never knew how long, but the amazing things that you can do in such a role. And I set out with my team to accomplish everything that was in my mandate letter, and we were pretty successful at that. But the responsibilities, extraordinary.
So as you became this powerful cabinet minister, what were the surprises?
Things started to change, and they started to change very early on. There were signs. I certainly continued to advocate for rights recognition for Indigenous peoples, and we continued to, more than pretty much any other minister, bring forward 13 pieces of legislation that passed Parliament. But I started to realize that being a minister, even though I had statutory authority for many things, there was a very significant and increasingly so degree of control that came from what we like to call the center, from the Prime Minister's office, from the Prime Minister, but also from unelected people within the Prime Minister's office that had alternate agendas than why I set out in the first place to run for political office.
How would it manifest itself?
Well, there were early signs of its manifestation. I mean, one, and I was part of the government, was not following through with our electoral promise for electoral reform and having it the last election first past the post. That was set aside. Having issues that I deeply cared about, that I knew about based on my lived experience and expertise, knowing what needed to be done, whether it be in the criminal justice system or on Indigenous issues. Those issues were set aside, or I was told to slow down, or I was advocating too much, or we are going to do this first. I understand now, reflecting back, how that crept up on me and the reasons why. One was political expediency. I mean, these are not issues that are going to be resolved within the life of one government, and the electoral benefit doesn't come fast and furious. These are long-term issues that we have to create the space to live beyond the life of a government. There's issues of, I learned the term red meat issues. Which is, those are issues that are not politically expedient to tackle, that would create fodder for opposition parties to condemn the government for doing them, or moving forward on mandatory minimum penalties, for example. The debate around this very polarizing issue, and certainly going into an election, it's the view of many politicians, particularly at the center, to not raise those issues that could cause challenges for us around the kitchen tables of Canadians in their houses.
So you put red meat aside.
So let's put red meat aside until after the next election, when we can do some tougher issues at the beginning of our mandate. That to me was a huge red flag, huge, and it caused me endless amounts of questioning and reflection in the very early hours of many mornings about whether or not I could continue on in that environment.
So things were tense with the Prime Minister, and then along comes SNC Lavalin.
Well, it was, I, as the Attorney General, I have essentially a Deputy Minister who's the Director of Public Prosecutions. The Director of Public Prosecutions made a decision not to enable or allow or use the tool that we had provided them to allow SNC to enter into a deferred prosecution agreement. I upheld her decision. And I mean, this was all very public, and many people within my government at the time, or the government, including within certainly the Prime Minister's office, didn't agree with that decision and tried to change my decision. And as I said, that's my decision to make, and political interference in the role of the Attorney General completely undermines, and our judicial process undermines, the rule of law and our institutions. And I was firm in not allowing that to happen.
it was just an amazing thing to watch someone say truth to power.
Yeah, I've had a lot of time to reflect on it, and people ask me if I have any regrets about what I did or the situation, and I have no regrets about what I did. I'm firm in the knowledge that I did the right thing, and that's not to say that it wasn't hard, but I certainly couldn't sit across from you right now and speak with the certainty and the comfort and the knowledge and the pride of who I am had I made a different decision. Maybe I lost my cabinet position and I got kicked out of a political party, but I'm still able to sit here knowing who I am, being comfortable with what I did. For me, we need to have discussions about how decisions are made in this country, and I appreciate the importance of cabinet confidentiality, but it can't be used as a shield for wrongdoing.
Now you're out of politics, so quickly, the future, are you going back to politics?
Who knows, there might be an opportunity down the road, but for right now, I'm really happy with the work that I'm doing.
Maybe if Jane Philpott were the Prime Minister?
Well, I think Jane Philpott was probably one of the best Prime Ministers we've never had, or is. And if she was going to get back in and have the pathway to be the Prime Minister, I'd be there doing whatever she asked me to do.
Thank you, Jody.
Thank you so much.
Jody Wilson-Raybould, a BC legend.